Hi everyone and welcome to the Week 9 lecture. There isn't any classes this week because there is a public holiday on Monday the 4th of October. That means there's no Monday classes, no Thursday classes and no online discussion activities for the week. There is, however, a quiz and you'll have a week in order to get that done.
This week what I'm going to do is introduce another idea about moral dialogues, which really are social processes. And when I'm thinking about social processes, I guess what I mean is the way in which societies change over time. So it's the way in which they do that, a process for doing that. Moral dialogues are really ways in which societies do change and adapt to new ideas and new values. And they do. I've seen that certainly in my own lifetime. And the reason why I'm doing that is because moral dialogues do have very similar stages to Stanley Cohen's moral panics. And so it might be possible to see something as both a moral panic and as a moral dialogue going on in a community. And I guess that's kind of what I'm going to be arguing about Safe Schools, that it could fit both the moral dialogue sort of framework as well as the moral panic. So you're not restricted to one or the other there. So moral dialogues is an idea from a German-born American sociologist whose name I have trouble pronouncing, so I'm going to leave that for you to read. And he reckons the thing about moral dialogues, these conversations that we have, which do change society over time, are usually about values. They are about what we think is important. They are about what we think is right or wrong. And therefore, they're not necessarily about facts. And that's where I guess having a reasoned conversation about something that's very important to somebody because it fits with their values can be difficult to have because it's an emotional attachment to an idea or a value that somebody has. So you can have all the reasoning that you like in the world, but they're not going to necessarily budge on that particular position. So he says they are about values. They're about what we think is important. It's that they're about what we think are right and wrong. They're not necessarily about facts at all. And they are social processes. It is one way in which societies do adapt and change over time. And he reckons that it's through these conversations, these moral dialogues, so moral meaning, what's right and what's wrong, that people form new understandings, new ways of thinking about things. And it's new ways of thinking about ethics and morality, both within a very small community, so it could happen at a very local level, perhaps at the university level or a small country town, but it also can happen at a national level. And we can, if you think about this in terms of climate change at the moment, we know that this is a debate we are having right now, a moral dialogue that we're having internationally as well. Sorry, that should be an I, not an O. That's very odd. And he reckons that moral dialogue suggests there are actually many, many issues that can't be settled by just thinking about the facts of a situation, because people do get very invested in what they think and believe is right and wrong, and therefore we're not going to reference facts. And I guess an example for me was when I suggested the idea that we get rid of the whole idea of public holidays for the Christian festivals of Christmas and Easter. And there was quite a deal of angst about that in the room, as if we did that, that would be an upsetting thing, because as many students says, it's deeply ingrained within us to have those particular public holidays. So, and that's about values, that's about what we think is right and wrong. That's also about, I guess, what we've done as a practice in the country for a long period of time. So it's not about the facts that perhaps there aren't very many people who identify as Christian in the country anymore. So many issues won't be resolved by resorting to facts. We have to have this other conversation, which can become very emotional. So moral dialogues are often very passionate. People have deep-seated beliefs and they want to hold to those, and that seems fair enough. So once something is very passionate and people are engaged in it, then it's not hard for other people to get engaged in that emotionally as well. They're often all over the place, not particularly orderly discussions at all, and they can be without a clear beginning and end. Don't necessarily have a resolution to them. Whole societies engage in them, and think about that when we've had discussions around climate change, Other discussions that happen, we do start talking about this at work, at home, on social media, of course. There are lots and lots of debates that happen on television, and I'm going to be using the Safe Schools example today. And so all of a sudden, when something has captured the national attention, then you will find there'll be lots and lots of debates across various mediums, and lots of stories are ongoing in the media as well. And sometimes we'll get to the point where we'll have some official or public inquiries, and they might happen at the parliamentary level. They might go further than that to having sort of the Royal Commissions. So moral dialogues often get started by something being published or something being said, something to get kicked off a debate. So a couple of examples. One is when Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. She's an American. She published it in 1962. And what she was interested in as an environmentalist, particularly she was interested in the ramifications at the use of pesticides in America at the time, which were just not, people weren't thinking about the impact of the pesticides on rivers and the earth at all at that particular time. So corporations were just going all out to increase agriculture by using pesticides. And she was very alarmed by that and eventually published her book, Silent Spring. And that sparked this moral dialogue, not just in America, but across the world, and ended up resulting in 1972 in the initiation of what was called an Earth Day. So it was really what I might call a consciousness-raising moment, where people suddenly have a conversation, a serious conversation, very widespread about something that's happened. That doesn't mean to say there was no conversation before, because there was, and she was talking about this for a long time before she published her book. Another example of a moral dialogue that occurred when it was sparked by something was Rosa Parks, who is an African-American woman who was arrested in 1955 because she was sitting on the right part of the bus, being a black woman, down the back of the bus, but because the bus got busy and a white man came on, she was asked to give up her seat. She was tired. She said, "No, I'm not giving up my seat." Because she didn't give up her seat to the white man, she was arrested for that. And that sparked, or is one of those moments that sparked the civil rights movement in America and then in Australia. So it was one of those, a catalyst really for an ongoing, very serious conversation, with a march on Washington in 1963, ongoing protests, particularly in the South, and leading to some sort of resolution, even though the problem is not fully solved there. Part of that resolution was what's called the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which prevented black people being discriminated against on their housing, but not just black people. People were also discriminated against in terms of higher rents, etc., depending on their race and their sex. So it brought in this new legislation. So it didn't signal the end of that conversation. I think it's an ongoing one, but certainly Rosa Parks, her refusing to give up her seat, sparked a national and then an international conversation. Another one here, closer to home, is the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, which is set up in Canberra in 1972. Has anybody seen the remnants of this in Canberra? This was in response to McMahon government's refusal to recognise Aboriginal land rights, and so there was a gathering of Aboriginal people setting up tents in Canberra around Parliament House. And that united Aboriginal people throughout the country, so they all started then gathering to talk about land rights, and it was supported by non-Aboriginal people as well, so we started to have a conversation. Conversation has not ended. It's an ongoing conversation in Australia, but the particular tent embassy part of it was made permanent in 1992, which is why it's possible for me to go and visit that, and you can visit that if you're in Canberra. So again, another conversation started when people have taken some form of action. So I wanted to pick up Hilary Silver's work now. She's a sociologist in America, George Washington University, and she reckons that these moral dialogues that happen are very much like Cohen's moral panics because they proceed through various stages. They start from some sort of baseline understanding in the community that perhaps something needs to change, or we know where we're at the present time. And then those dialogue starters, and I've given some examples of those, start up a conversation that then often goes kind of wild for a while, and people get very heated about it, passionate for whatever change and passionate against whatever change. So they do draw on a lot of emotion. Rachel Carson also used facts in her, she had a lot of evidence in terms of the damage of pesticides happening in American rivers. But there's a lot of a passion and emotion in these sorts of debates, and they're deliberately drawn on as well, certainly the emotion. And the emotion is deliberately encouraged and invoked through dramatisations, particular people's experiences, for example, and through demonstration. And then sometimes there's some sort of resolution. You can see some attitudes maybe changing in the community, maybe some values, maybe there's some behaviour shifts, maybe even the law is eventually changed. So she uses that model, the moral dialogue, to explain changes in regard to norms around sexual harassment. And what she reckons is that sexual harassment has been illegal, and it has been in Australia as well as in America, since the 1970s. So it's been illegal. However, it kept on happening. So it was a practice that kept on happening quite frequently, even though it shouldn't have been. She reckons the dialogue starter in this example was in 2016. There was considerable outrage, first in America and then internationally, over Donald Trump's sort of locker room talk about women, and that was caught on tape, and so he was exposed as being quite misogynistic and having sexually harassed a number of women. So he's bragging about it. There was then a protest on the day after his inauguration, on the 21st of January in 2017, and the photos there illustrate some of the women who knitted pink hats, which they called pink pussy hats, and then they marched on Washington. I think they continue to march, but they no longer do the pink hats for lots of reasons. And then after that, very prominent women started revealing the assault and harassment by very prominent men in the American community, for example, Harvey Weinstein. So there were these stages going on in this moral dialogue. And then she says, well, what's the resolution? Well, there's definitely been a change in attitude across the world that sexual harassment is no longer acceptable, even though it's been illegal for a long time. It is no longer acceptable. What she says, though, is even though we might have changed our attitudes broadly in the community, that this is no longer tolerable, that perhaps that needs to be reflected in legal proceedings as well. So the law that was already there needs to back up women and people who bring forward claims about sexual harassment. So that's the stages, and that's why she says this is actually analogous to Stanley Cohen's moral panic. So another catalyst or conversation starter, a moment, a catalyst moment that I wanted to talk about, was in 1979. There was a book published by Janice Raymond, who's still around. She was a philosopher at the University of Massachusetts for a number of years, and she published what is called a founding text. So one of those texts that becomes really a big deal, and everybody has to read it if they're interested in this. And it was a founding text of a particular movement called gender critical, gender abolitionist philosophy, which I'll talk about a bit more. What she did was argue in 1979 that transsexualism reinforces traditional gender stereotypes. So when people trans from either man to woman or the other way around. And she said that this teaches us all that it's actually easier to change our bodies than to change society. So she said that trans women don't know what it's like to be a woman, and that's because she regards gender to be socially constructed, but trans women don't have the lived experience of being a woman. And she talks about the history. They don't have the history of menstruation, they don't have the history of having babies and nurturing, and all of the history that comes with that. They also don't have the history or the experience of discrimination because they're women, and all of those things that come with living as female. And she maintains back in 1979 that what she called the medical psychiatric complex was medicalising gender identity. And she was criticised, and is still criticised, for being prejudiced against trans people. And what she says on her website, so some years later, she says no one, women, men, children, or transgendered persons should be subject to any form of exploitation or targeted for discrimination. So that's where she's saying she's not discriminating against this particular people. She goes on to say transsexual and transgendered persons are entitled to the same human and civil rights as others. So she's countering that charge of prejudice and discrimination. But she goes on to say recognising these rights, however, does not mean that we must accept that hormones and surgery transform men into women and women into men, or that persons who self-identify as members of the opposite sex are what they subjectively claim to be. And she says that critics of transgender that hormone surgery and self-identification do not transform men into women and women into men. Any dissent from the view that men can become women and women men is said to come from a transphobic cast of mind that is hateful and discriminatory, not from a different viewpoint, at odds with an ideology that those men who identify as trans women are actually women, and those women who identify as trans men are actually men. So she hasn't changed her view a lot since 1979. It aligns very much with what she was saying back in 1979, except that she is countering that perspective that she's being discriminatory. So she's what might be called a gender critical feminist, someone who believes that gender is a social construct distinct from biological sex. Before I go there, I'm just going to go over to doing the idea of doing gender, put forward in about 1987 by a couple of sociologists, Candace West and Don Zimmerman, and that's what they talk about as well, that we do gender, that gender is something we accomplish. It's not something we're born with, it's something that we learn how to do. And they say that doing gender involves a complex of socially guided, perceptual, interactional and micro-political, so micro being at the small level, activities that cast particular pursuits as expressions of masculine and feminine natures. For them, gender is not a property of individuals, but it's an outcome. It's something that happens as a result of a whole lot of social arrangements that we put in place and a whole lot of meanings that we put on femininity and masculinity, and it's a way, they argue, of legitimating one of the most fundamental divisions that we have in society, and that is between women and men, between masculinity and femininity. And what they say in their work is they make these distinctions between sex category and gender, where sex is the determination that's made when we apply the social, and it's the socially agreed upon, biological criteria for classifying persons as females or males. So, and often that's genitalia at birth, but it doesn't necessarily need to be these days. Chromosome testing before birth. Then they talk about sex category. So when we find out, for example, that a woman is having a baby, a boy or a girl, then often there's a whole lot of imagination goes in place. It's very hard for anybody to get by who's pregnant and not be asked that question. Do you know if you're having a boy or a girl? What's the sex of the child? And then we start doing a whole lot of things to display the fact that we're having a boy or a girl. And often there's the classic pink and blue colouring. So you wouldn't necessarily, unless you were very conscious of gender ideas, you wouldn't necessarily give a boy something that was pink or give a girl something that was blue, although that's probably more acceptable than the other way around, interestingly enough. So that's sex category, and then gender. So gender, they say, is managing situated conduct, so our conduct in a particular situation, in light of a whole lot of normative ideas and attitudes that are appropriate for one sex category. For example, I've got there, it's okay for men to take up a lot more space physically, the idea of man spreading that we have these days, than it is for women, who are expected to take up a whole lot less space. So more likely for women to cross their legs than men, for example. So back to this gender critical feminist perspective, that's where they're coming from when they're thinking about these ideas. They believe that gender is a social construct quite distinct from biological sex. And they believe that gender distinctions should be abolished. Rather than an individual changing their body to fit, from this perspective, what should be happening is that society should change and accommodate everybody without these gender norms for the way that we behave, for what we do, for our attributes, etc. So we should abolish the idea of masculinity and femininity. So that's where they're coming from. This can lead to a group called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, who only accept those who are assigned or labelled female at birth as women. And for them that's a protest against the patriarchy or the rule of women by men. And they're opposed, therefore, to trans women accessing women's spaces, for example, public bathrooms. They are regarded as fueling transphobia, and really they're much more influential in the United Kingdom than they are here or in Canada or the United States. But another important conversation starter that happened as a backlash or a reaction against that position was written by a trans woman, Sandy Stone, in 1987. Now, she was actually mentioned in Janice Raymond's book back in 1979 and felt as if she had been attacked and called out and therefore excluded. But there was lots of conversations going on about what do we do about trans women in these women-only spaces. And women-only, in that wider context, women-only spaces were quite important during the second wave feminist movement as an opportunity for women to get together and talk about their experiences. So this was a response to Janice Raymond's book, written by trans woman Sandy Stone, and it became another founding text. So one of those books that you have to have read, really, if you want to know anything about this area, and it became a founding text of transgender studies. And one of now many responses to gender critical feminists. And what she said recently on a podcast that I was listening to, Sandy Stone, she said, now we have an academic field called transgender studies, and we have academic transgender people at conferences having caucuses, and we have conferences at which most of the attendees are transgender. So the two conversation starters, quite different. One in favour of transgender people, one opposed to that for different reasons. Very important conversation starters. Then we could move to more trans-inclusive feminists who use the language of cisgender, and this is mostly from the 1990s, where if there's an alignment between your biological sex and your gender identity, then you say that you're cisgender. It became very important and popular from 2007, thanks to a book by Julia Serrano. And it was added to the Oxford Dictionary in 2015 and is in the Macquarie Dictionary as well. And that's important because words are getting into a dictionary is quite a democratic process. If we don't use the words, they won't get in there. And if we don't use the words, they'll get out as well. So if a word is used a lot, a new word, that's how it gets into the dictionary. So it became a very important new way of describing oneself, and is a way of being very supportive as signals that you're being inclusive of people who have different experiences of gender. And along those lines, there's a quote here from Robin Dembroff recently: violence against non-binary persons and trans men, discrimination against gay and gender non-conforming non-trans men, and cosmetic genital surgeries on infants who are intersex are neither separate nor separable from the violence, discrimination and body policing that non-trans women constantly experience. We have an explanatorily powerful unifying story to tell about what holds these forms of marginalisation and mistreatment together. They are all manifestations of misogyny, which means the hatred of women. The force that, in philosopher Kate Mann's terms, patrols and polices the patriarchal order, where patriarchal order refers to a social organisation where men rule over women, but some people might prefer to use the term gender order, which is about ways in which masculinity and femininity are shaped into power relationships and where the masculine is dominant. So even when we're talking about transgender, what we're talking about, or transsexual, we're talking about gender, is what she's saying. So can we separate doing gender from maintaining heteronormativity, where heteronormativity is the idea that heterosexuality is the norm. It's the way that we're supposed to have sex. And so sociologists Kristen Stewart and Lauren Westbrook, who are Americans as well, say no, we can't separate doing gender from maintaining heteronormativity. Heterosexuality requires this binary sex system, this attraction between two opposites, and you'll even find that if you look up the ABS and you're looking for details about men and women, they talk about opposite sex. So there's this taken for granted expectation that heterosexuality and gender identity follow from genitalia and produces heteronormativity. And yet, these sociologists say genitals aren't visible in most social interactions. People don't expect, though, a mismatch between biology and gender presentation. We expect things all to line up. But transgender people can do gender without having the biology to match. And they conducted a study looking at how gender normal people respond to trans women and trans men. And what they find is that heterosexual cisgender men very often respond with violence, which is coded masculine, if they discover their sexual partner is trans. And heterosexual cisgender women can't respond with violence because that's coded masculine if they discover their sexual partner is trans. Therefore, they either accept their partner or end the relationship. And what they say is that the extremity, that violence, the extremity of men's responses shows the depth of threat of transgender bodies to heteronormativity within sexual situations and the need to neutralise it through what they call hypergendered responses. So I keep on thinking back to people's reactions about the idea of removing public holidays for Christmas, how upsetting that could be for people because they're so ingrained. If you put that alongside ideas about gender, which are also very, very deeply ingrained, you can understand why people get upset about it. But men will react more violently, is what these sociologists are saying, because that's coded as a masculine activity and women won't. They call these gender panics that are happening. They ask the question, why are transgender people accepted in some places, for example at work, and not in others, for example public toilets? And they looked at a whole lot of media articles, thousands of them, between 2006 and 2010. And they found this opposition to transgender recognition often brought up a fear of sexual predators in these sex-segregated spaces. And the fears, though, they say, were only about women's spaces, particularly bathrooms. They weren't about men's-only spaces. So when they were talking about sex-segregation and they looked at the media articles, what was really striking was the absence of men's spaces, that people were really talking about just women's spaces. And their argument is that bodies perceived as male shouldn't be allowed in women-only spaces because they might be sexually dangerous to women and to children. And so what they're saying is that there's a conflation between the idea of sex predators, who are imagined as deviant men, so a conflation between that and transgender women, who are imagined as male. So they suggest that it's actually genitals rather than gender identity that drive these gender panics, which they call penis panics. Most people are assumed to be heterosexual, therefore sex-segregated bathrooms are thought to be sexuality-free zones. And the opposition to trans women in women-only bathrooms centres on that fear of the wrong body in a woman-only space. Thus, a gender panic, they say, is really a penis panic. And penis panics reinforce gender inequality. They say that for a number of reasons. First up, that women are weak and are in need of protection. Men are inherent rapists and perpetuate fears about transgender people as well, and suggest that transgender people are less deserving of protection than cisgender women and children. Therefore, the sociologists say bathroom battles are actually about transgender rights and about reproducing or challenging beliefs about what it is to be a woman or a man. Come to safe schools and think about this in terms of it being a moral dialogue, a moral panic, or perhaps a gender panic. And I'm calling on Shannon and Smith's work, and they use queer to mean people who defy heteronormative conventions of sexuality and gender presentation. And they reckon it's not simple to talk about sexuality and gender at schools because it promotes or aggravates or concerns community anxiety. And often, therefore, what they say, because of the concern about panic in a school community if we talk about sex and sexuality and gender identity, then what happens is that teachers usually don't say anything. So there's this whole thing about silence out of fear because of a backlash. So one way to talk about sexuality and gender at school is actually to present queer lives lived through their experience of, family, identity, and their everyday lives and activities. Present, by the way that people live and talk about their experiences, present alternatives to heteronormative assumptions, which then challenge normative privilege. Questions are always raised about this. Is this a legitimate claiming of a subject and a voice, or is it about identity politics? And you'll see that always playing out in these sorts of debates. First of all, they talk about a ban on a movie called Gaby Baby, which was a documentary made in 2013 by Maya Newell. And it explored the lives of 4 children of same-sex couples. And so what it does, therefore, is challenge any ideas about what's a normal Australian family. It was very, very successful nationally and internationally when it was released. And then it was scheduled, so there was one same-sex school in Sydney scheduled it to be shown during school time for Wear It Purple Day on the 28th of August 2015. But there was this media uproar that happened before the showing of the film, I should say, on the 26th of August. Lots of people said things like it's a gay push, should be kept out of schools, and reported a backlash from parents, so parents got upset about it as well. And there was a minister who said that the school was promoting a gay agenda. So lots of backlash in the community until it got to the point where the New South Wales Education Minister ordered a ban on showing the film at least during school time. So they couldn't go ahead with their original plans. They could show the film after hours, but they couldn't do it during school times, which is kind of an unprecedented thing for an education minister to jump in. On the back of that, we had the whole saga around the Safe Schools. The Safe Schools Coalition was sort of a national network, really, of not one, but a number of organisations working with schools to create safer and more inclusive environments for queer people. There was a Melbourne group, Minus 18, which published a resource called All of Us, and that was going to be used for teaching around sexuality and gender diversity in the classroom. And the resource uses stories like the one in the film, Gaby Baby. So it's talking to people who have diverse experiences and talking about what their life is like. It was very much an opt-in program. It wasn't forced on schools in any way, shape or form. It was federally funded program, launched in 2014, initiated by the Labor government in 2013. And the rationale was discussion. So rather than teachers fearing that they couldn't say anything because of a backlash or a moral panic, the idea was, well, let's have a moral dialogue. They probably didn't use it, but it's kind of what they meant. Let's have a discussion about this and set up schools so that they can be skilled teachers and also create safe places for queer people. There was, as you know, already lots of controversy directed at Safe Schools Coalition. Senator Cory Bernardi was very outspoken. He told Sky News that Safe Schools was intimidating and bullying kids into conforming to what is the homosexual agenda. And former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said this was all a case of social engineering. In February 2016, Prime Minister Turnbull was Prime Minister at the time, and he requested a review of the program. So there was so much backlash in the community that he said, well, we better have a look at this. And this is what I mean by public inquiry. There was some sort of inquiry. And then he ordered some changes to be made. According to The Guardian, the changes sharply reduced the lesson content, restrict it from secondary schools, whereas previously it was available for primary schools as well, shift the program onto a government website, which you can still access, remove all links to other materials and sites, and add a requirement that students have to go and get parental consent before they participate, and schools get parent body consent before opting in to use the materials. The sort of comments that were being made were often likening the Safe Schools program agenda to Nazi Germany. For example, I wasn't in any way, Lyle Shelton says, saying that same-sex marriage or anything, Safe Schools was like the Holocaust. What I'm saying is at the moment we've got some bad ideas being put forward in public policy, telling young people, children as young as 4 in public schools, that no one can tell you what gender you are through this gender fairy public relations, which actually didn't belong to that coalition at all. He goes on to say this is what happened in the 1930s in Germany. The parallel is between speaking up or not speaking up when bad ideas are put forward in public policy. It is no offence to anyone at all. It did become a federal election issue, at least for some groups. Family First and Australian Christians ran on the platform that the Safe Schools should be removed. Yet, in the midst of the controversy that was going on, lots of media articles, lots of television debates and discussions, 32 schools opted in during that time. The program ceased in 2017 in 3 states, including in South Australia, and then it was continuing until October 2017 in Western Australia, Queensland, Northern Territory and Tasmania. The figures are that it's trained about 17,000 educators nationally, and there is some evidence of Christian schools participating. So we shouldn't think that all Christians think the same, because there were those who were violently opposed to it and likening it to Nazi Germany, to people who actually participated in the program. And there were 3 examples given by Hickey and Cotter, one being Jim Larson from a fairly large school, who said the motivation was an acknowledgement, this is an Anglican community college, was an acknowledgement that their school was not really a safe place for queer people. And some students were therefore avoiding school, and others weren't able to participate. So they wanted the resources to help their students and help the students navigate a society where they didn't really fit in and where they see difference every day. Another example was a small sort of flow centre, which was Catholic oriented. And this man reports that they've mainly used the program in staff development to increase sensitivity and awareness of working with all of their students. And the final example that I have is of a large Catholic boys' school, who said that really what they were wanting to produce were well-balanced, emotionally intelligent young men who were capable of intimate, healthy, heterosexual relationships, but at the same time they supported their queer students who suffer mental health issues if they lack support. So that was 3 examples of Catholic schools openly participating and supporting the program. Thinking about this in terms of a moral panic, if we go back to Stanley Cohen's formulation, he said, number 1, a threat emerges, and for some people that was the Safe Schools program. That was a threat that emerged for many people. That meant that the schools were beginning to preach a particular ideology to schools, to children in schools. The second stage of that was the media presentation and lots of sort of commentary around children being harmed, children being brainwashed, children being programmed in a particular way, particularly in terms of the so-called gay agenda. And then, of course, we did have the moral barricades being armed, and I mentioned some of those with Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister getting involved, the Christian lobbyists, for example, as well. And then the socially accredited experts weren't just, I think, those representatives from the Christian groups, but also mothers who set up, some groups of mothers actually set up opposing websites as well in opposition to the Safe Schools program. And then ways of coping is the 5th stage. So there was a review of the program, and subsequently there was a defunding of it as well. So that's one way of thinking about, and I think it's a very valid way of thinking about the Safe Schools saga. However, there's a comment here from Shannon and Smith that I think is really important to take into account. And what they say is that the public attention on the Gaby Baby and Safe Schools saga has provided something of an education for Australians, and arguably working in favour of a progressive agenda in certain ways. Many more Australian schools have become accredited than have withdrawn, and the massive media exposure that the All of Us resources received would have helped them to reach many more trans and gender questioning young people than they perhaps otherwise would have. So they're arguing that there was more than just a panic going on here. There was actually an education happening as well. In view of these developments, they say, perhaps it is time for us to avoid equating controversy, and there was lots of that, with failure. Perhaps we shouldn't do that at all because of this idea that we've been re-educating Australia. Critique, they say, of deep-seated beliefs about sexuality, gender and morality in a society that is simultaneously obsessed with and enraged by the sexualisation of youth is unlikely ever to be a simple task. Therefore, I think this controversy could also fit within the framework of a moral dialogue. We begin with a baseline understanding something that does need to be done about queer kids being bullied at school, and I think that everybody agreed with that, no matter where they were on the side of that debate. The dialogue starters set up discussions. There was Cory Bernardi, whom I talked about. There was the whole discussion going on about children being bullied into this so-called homosexual agenda. They absolutely drew more on emotion, I think, than on reason, and I guess in terms of the reason argument, there was a presentation of the suicides, of the impact of bullying of queer kids in school, which often resulted in mental health issues and an unprecedented number of suicides. So that would be the reason side. Often there wasn't any reason, it was just the emotion, the whole idea that children were being harmed. And then emotion was evoked through dramatisations and demonstrations. There were protests. There were protests in support of safe schools, and there were also protests against safe schools as well. So the resolution, was there a resolution? Did the law change? Well, in actual fact, the Safe Schools program was defunded, but there is, I would say, but I'd be keen to hear what you think as well, that there is far greater awareness in the community now, before that controversy, about the issues for queer kids in schools, within the school communities, but in the broader communities as well. So I do think that there has been an education going on in Australia. In summary, what I've done is introduce the idea of moral dialogues, which I said are these social processes, ways by which societies change over time and which shift our understandings of what's right and what's wrong. Now, I think that there's probably lots of people who still disagree with what the Safe Schools was trying to accomplish in some way, but I don't think that anybody in the community wants, any of those adults who were talking for or against, wants queer kids to be bullied. So I think there has been some shifting of our understandings. And then what we've also done is considered that heteronormativity and gender are bound together inextricably, so that when we have panics around trans people, then what we could call these, I think, are gender panics. We're worried about these deep-seated ingrained ideas about gender that we've all been raised with. And then what I've done is thought about the Safe Schools saga as being both a moral panic and possibly a gender panic as well. Kind of leave that up to you to persuade me for or against that, and a moral dialogue. And I guess I use it fits both of the patterns really quite well. There was a panic in the community, there's no doubt about that, but there was also this conversation that went on in the community about what's right and what's wrong, and what we want for our children, what we don't want for our children as well. And I guess everybody does agree that we want our children to be safe in school, even if people didn't like some of the gender diversity ideas that were put forward.